Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CBC virtual program, a talk with the 2025 winners of the CBC Graphic Novel Advocate Award. My name is Summer Wisner, and I am the program coordinator with the Children's Book Council. I am also the CBC point person on the Graphic Novel Committee. So on behalf of the committee, I thank you all for attending today's inaugural event, hearing from today's winners. For this webinar, I'm happy that we have both publishers and teachers, librarians, booksellers, fellow graphic novel enthusiasts in attendance today. A bit about the award itself. The CBC Graphic Novel Award was made to celebrate individuals who demonstrate a lifetime of exemplary commitment to and the advancement of children's, middle grade, and young adult graphic novels as a literary source over the span of their career. You can read more about this new award and this year's winners on the CBC site at cbcbooks.org. Before we start, I'd like to go over some general housekeeping for this panel. First and foremost, this panel is being recorded and it will be posted on the CBC site at a later date. Second, we have enabled closed captioning. So if you'd like to use that feature, feel free to use or to select it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Lastly, we will have time for a Q&A at the end. We have reviewed some great questions in the RSVPs, and we hope to answer as many as possible during the course of this conversation. Now, without further ado, let's hear from the four winners themselves. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Mel Schuit, who is the Assistant Children's Marketing and Publicity Director at the Quarto Group and a member of the CBC Graphic Novel Committee. Take it away, Mel.
Thank you, Summer, and thanks so much to the Children's Book Council for letting me lead this group. I am really excited to be here amongst some of the strongest advocates that we have out there for children's graphic novels and comics. I'm going to go ahead and just introduce them right now, starting in alphabetical order with Robin Brenner, the head of reference and programming and former teen librarian of Woburn Public Library, Massachusetts, and editor at No Flying, No Tights. Meg Lemke, comics and graphic novels reviews editor, Publishers Weekly, and editor-in-chief of MUTHA magazine. Whitney Leopard, executive editor, Random House Graphic and Ink Pop. And Eva Volin, supervising children's librarian at Alameda Free Library in Alameda, California. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. We have a lot of questions to get through, so I think we're going to go ahead and just dive in. Thanks for letting me lead you through this. I'm really excited to be here with you. I think one of the top questions that a lot of people had is sort of what makes a graphic novel so unique? And I think that one of the questions that sort of stems from that is what's something that a graphic novel can do that a quote unquote regular book, something that's text only or prose, can't really do? And are there any particular topics or interest levels that you think are particularly suited for graphic novels? And we're just going to start in the order that I introduced you. So we'll start with Robin on that one.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'm excited to talk to everybody, both on the panel and to the audience today. I think for me, comics are simply different from other ways of telling stories. So they are unique in the way that they combine pictures and words, and even not always words with wordless comics, but they make your brain process the story differently, and they make your brain do different work to make the story make sense. So that's why, when I talk to people who are just starting reading comics, I advise them to slow down, give themselves time, and think through what are the connections they're seeing. Look at each page longer than you would look at a prose page because you're so used to just zooming through text that you need to learn how to stop and look at the pictures and make the connections. But for me, I think there are certain things they are very good at. There's some emotional impact that can be really powerful that's just in an image or in what I think of as the space and the time that can happen in comics. So the turn of a page, an extended sequence of very quiet panels, that's a very different feeling. And then also things I personally have found, for example, I can understand certain scientific ideas or, an invention or something like that if I have the diagram and the pictures together and someone walking me through the setup. I remember learning more about particle particle physics than I ever thought I would in reading the Feynman biography. And I finally was like, now I get it. I get why, that works. So that kind of explanation can be really powerful if your brain works that way. With mine does. It works with pictures and words. That's how I think. So for me, it works really well.
That makes complete sense. Meg, we'll go over to you. Did you want to add to that?
I mean, just hopping on a lot of what Robin said, that's also called multimodal literacy. So the idea that visual literacy is part of understanding a work. And I think that one thing that I find really interesting about comics and graphic novels is the ways that they're in conversation with medium like film. And also, so there's this kind of cinematic understanding of comics, but there's interactivity with the reader. So you are processing and understanding the work in the same way that you receive or interact with a film. It just engages very different cognitive processes. And I think there's something in an educational context as well about that isn't just about accessibility and engagement or like high engagement with visuals, but actually a kind of work that's being done and can be unpacked and slowed down. There's a temporality to it where you can think of a film being broken into stills where you can interact with each page. So you control the time at which it processes, which can sometimes be by the literal turning of the page. And with how zoomy some comics are, there's interesting tension there. Something that, I may even repeat later in some of the questions I've seen about thinking about how to explain comics to novel or novice readers is that we don't often stop and say, is poetry worth reading because it has a visual element on the page? But it does. The organization or the understanding of how to slow down and read poetic text, I think, is quite akin to how to slow down and read comics.
That is a very astute point. I think that's very interesting. Eva, did you want to add to that?
Sorry, I totally thought you were going to go to Whitney. In addition to what Robin and Meg said, graphic novels help inspire visual literacy, which in today's society is crucial. And it's really hard to teach visual literacy if there's nothing on the page that's visual. And we know this because of picture books. We're using picture books to link the words on the page with the pictures on the page to help young people understand what's going on. And suddenly in third grade, they're not allowed to use that tool anymore. And graphic novels are a part of learning the same way picture books are part of learning. So I'll leave that there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yes, yay for the power of picture books. Wholly agreed. Let's shift gears just a tiny bit and talk about how we feel about graphic novels promoting literacy. And I want to start with Whitney on this one.
Yeah, thank you very much. I feel like the key way that they promote literacy is that because kids want to read them, and the main thing about getting kids to read is to get their interest in reading, is to build that interest. There's so many kids where like maybe starting like a full prose novel or starting a different sort of format ends up seeming very like just it doesn't interest them, or they just have a hard time sitting down with it. But starting them with graphic novels, they eventually they read graphic novels, they love graphic novels, then they start reading prose books and they love prose books. It's not one or nothing. It's one of those things where we want kids reading everything. And I find that graphic novels are just such a great way for to promote that. But also just like kind of what Meg talked about earlier with visual literacy, like promoting all types of literacy. There's critical thinking with graphic novels because you're marrying both the art and the text, the visual literacy, the emotional nuance, because you can, unlike with a like television or something like that, where like I guess nowadays a lot of like cartoons are like 11 minutes, but like, TV shows that are also pretty short. With the graphic novel, if you're in a scene, you can sit with that scene for as long as you want to sit with that scene. And I find that is something that just adds into how people can kind of experience as they're, diving into these amazing stories.
Absolutely. We're going to go backwards with the alphabet this time, and we're going to start with Eva. Anything to add to that?
Not a whole lot. People will talk about how kids read graphic novels over and over and over and over and over again. And one of the reasons they're doing that is because every time they read it, they see something else. and it's one of the reasons why people go back and reread prose.
Yeah.
But with graphic novels, you've got more to absorb in there. And that's great because you want kids in the beginning to learn to love reading. And if they love reading graphic novels, there's a good chance they're going to love reading other things. And so the same with little kids reading picture books or easy readers over and over and over again, because there's the comfort and familiarity there. It's the same is happening with graphic novels, but you're also expanding the critical thinking, you're expanding the visual literacy, you're expanding their understanding of what they're seeing, which means they're more likely to take a deeper dive into what they read in the future.
I'm just going to have to stop myself from doing this like every single time you all give a response, because yes, it's a different kind of literacy, and it's very, I mean, it speaks to why they continue to go back to the same content again and again and again, because they are catching new things. Meg, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I love to talk about this, both because, earlier in my career, I was an editor at Teachers College Press, where we did a lot of work on reading comics and comics as a tool for literacy development, but also as a parent to two children who are at very different stages in their literacy. My son, who is 6, actually has just learned to read, and he was what you might characterize as a reluctant reader. My daughter, who's almost 14, is a very avid reader, and as she does what Jean Yang talks about, a reading without walls, seeing herself go between comics and prose. And I will say that as a parent, when my daughter was, even as someone who works in the industry, was delighted she liked comics, I got nervous for a little bit when she was reading comics, exclusively for a period of time in graphic novels. I mean, she was at the height of like smile coming out, she was right there, right? And I will say now I'm actually reading for an award in the background, and I've been trying to have her help me read some of the YA, like read alongside me. And she loves to do it, but she'll be like, Mom, I've got to read All Quiet on the Western Front. Like, I'm reading this for school. And then she has these mysteries she's obsessed with. I mean, just seeing how much her identity as a reader, like allowing her to identify as a reader through the love of reading graphic novels, did not in any way stop her from then identifying that much more strongly as a reader generally of books. And I think appreciating comics and graphic novels as books is what allows that identity to be a lifelong identity for learners. Whereas an interesting thing I've noticed with my son is the ways that as he's now reading aloud comics, graphic novels on the page, it's helping with his understanding of expressiveness and dialogue, which is a read aloud skill that they're really looking to teach, which also helps writing. So the way that dialogue is used in comics and emphasized in most comics really helps kids to understand character development. It's not just about literacy, but also reading comprehension. And I think it creates a visual map for reading comprehension that, particularly with emerging readers, scaffolds some of these really core concepts like dialogue, character development, movement on a page, plot development. And I see his enthusiasm for rereading, as Eva talked about, is something that his teacher talks about constantly. Like, they want us to read the same passages over and over again because it's such a core piece in the key for emerging readers to become proficient readers. So the fact that comics encourage that is such an important step in literacy development.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but I think it might actually have been you, Meg, with the, comparing it to like something being on screen. I mean, we go back to our favorite TV shows all the time because we're catching new things. Why not go back to our favorite graphic novels for the same reason, and continue to, build that literacy? Robin, do you want to add to this question?
Sure. One thing I was thinking as people were talking, the other thing that I always kind of whip out to tell people about comics specifically is the level of vocabulary is very high. And in particular, the statistic I can always quote, especially at parents who are concerned, is that usually the vocabulary level is 1 grade level higher than a prose book would be aimed at the same age. So that's an important thing to remember. Comics are so precise and specific about how they use all of the words that they use that you learn new and interesting words as you go through. But the other thing I did want to comment is definitely what everyone has said is very true in all my experience, especially working with youth over the course of 18 years. But in particular, one of the things I noticed with my teens is that you hit that point in high school, especially where kids get overwhelmed. They stop reading for fun. They feel like it's always a chore and it's always upsetting. And I have met so many parents and kids who were just like, the classic thing is the last book they read that they liked is Hatchet when they were like 11. And they've not read a book since then that they felt like they could bring up as a favorite. And
Yeah.
so it's so important to, as we've all discussed, like you need to understand how important it is for any kid to discover or rediscover how exciting it is to read a book that they like on their own in its entirety. And for some kids, that's a graphic novel that will make that work for them and make them remember why reading is fun, why it's exciting, and why they can learn a lot from it. So that's how I kind of think of it, is that I had a number of times with teens where their parent would come back and be like, oh my gosh, my kid sat on the couch and read an entire thing by themselves. They haven't done that in years. And that's what it is. That's the power of how it can work.
I love that. This question is for Whitney and for Meg. What trends are you noticing in graphic novels for kids right now? And are there any trends that maybe you want to see or maybe want to see come back? We'll start with Whitney.
I was about to ask, I was like, who goes first? No, I mean, I feel like the biggest trend that I see in graphic novels is kind of like contemporary escapism, where the world is grounded in our reality, so it's something where the kids can connect with it. But it might just be a true contemporary story that's something that other people are drama, friends, family, whatever that they're dealing with at school, or it might be something where it's like contemporary plus is usually what I call it, because it's like contemporary with a secondary genre.
A little something.
Yeah, with something. And I feel like that is something that I just constantly see resonating with readers, like finding readers who are looking for more stories like that. Like they want stories that take them to other locations, take them to other countries, but also maybe explore themes of like how other these characters are dealing with their friendship trouble, or dealing with family trouble, or dealing with some other trouble, whether it's real or perceived, along the way sort of situation. And I think that grounding is just something we'll continue to see in graphic novels. What would I like to see? I mean, everything. I want to see everything. There's so many types of readers out there. There's so many kids who have all these different interests, and I would just love to see the graphic novels just continue to grow, and for publishers to continue to do different types of stories, and just bring in different voices and different characters and just all these other elements. And luckily I think we're doing it. It's just it'll take a little while, because graphic novels take a little while to make.
Certainly do. Meg?
So some bigger picture trends that I think are business related to some extent are that manga for kids is a huge incoming force. There's been a number of new imprints actually growing to focus on manga for kids, which has been a gap in the North American marketplace. So we're going to see that in a big way, I think, coming forward in the next couple of years. And how that's going to look will be really interesting. So a huge book out recently was Unico by Samuel Satin, which came out from Scholastic Graphics, and it's leading what I think they're going to develop new manga, and Random House Graphic has started a manga imprint as well. And similarly, especially in the teen space, webtoons to book is an enormous trend in comics publishing generally. And it's certainly coming along on the YA side. And a lot of the books that are on the adult side are really like younger adult topics in the first place. And we've also seen imprints develop that are doing a lot of webtoon to book. Then I would say at a more like micro level, something that's a continuing trend is writers who have been in the adult space moving to the young adult and middle grade space, and also people who've been really strong in the picture book space moving to the middle grade graphic novel space, like Ruth Chan, who's a celebrated picture book author, had her first graphic memoir for middle grade readers out this year. I highlighted two books. PW does biannual previous issue where we look at like our picks for the forthcoming season. And I highlighted that Kay Roten, who did Cannonball as an adult, has their first young adult book out, and also Brianna Lowenson, whose adult book was beautiful work from Fantagraphics, has a young adult book that got a star review at PW out. So we're seeing, I think, a lot of folks who've established themselves in the adult market see this as an area they want to play in and grow in. Also, not to be mentioning my amazing daughter again, but I will tell you that she brought home Heartstopper from her school library. I didn't even need to give it to her, as well as, you know, she just keeps buying those. So I think that Heartstopper started something, and we're seeing so much romance, especially like boys love, even though it's not necessarily manga, you know, queer romance has got a huge growing in adult readership, and I'm seeing publishers follow that.
Yeah, it's easy to jump on those trends. This question is for Eva and for Robin. When considering early chapter book graphic novels and more middle grade focused ones, where do you think they would best be found? The context for this is someone's been moving them around to different areas so that their audience can find them and been having some difficulties. So where in the library, where on the bookshelves, where do you recommend that these books go? We'll start with Eva.
I'm a children's librarian, so I deal with this also. I have people coming in looking specifically for graphic novels for early readers and also for nonfiction readers. And I put them all in the graphic novel section because that's where the kids want to be standing when they find the perfect book. So I have my nonfiction graphic novels, I have my early reader graphic novels, I've got my graphic novels, and then I've got my manga for kids. And we actually did specify that we weren't shelving the manga by trim size. We were actually shelving it because it's manga, because we have kids coming in looking specifically for Japanese comics written for a Japanese audience translated into English. So I did not pull out like the Elephant and Piggy books. They're still in the early readers. They could technically be argued to be graphic novels, one panel per page. But I left those where people expect to find those, and I pulled the graphic novels and put them in graphic novels where people want to find them because they want to be seen to be reading graphic novels.
Robin agrees.
Yeah, I was going to say basically the same thing. We worked really hard with our graphic novels in our youth. Well, across our library, we always had 3 sections, which was graphic, manga, and super. And that was in every single age range to make it easy for people to find those types. But in terms of things like the easy reader graphic novels or easy graphics, we were just talking about, do we set up a separate section in the easy section? Do we put them with the graphic novels? And there'd been a lot of debating about where they would best fit. There was also some question of whether there were enough of them to make a whole section unto themselves, because there probably will be, but right now there's only a few. So we were having a whole debate around that. But I think in the long run, exactly what Eva said, that the kids want to look where they want to look. So if they're going to look in the graphic novel section, that's where they should mostly be. If you have the budget for it, you can always buy 1 copy of each, you know, and put them in different places. But most libraries do not have that kind of spending cash. So I always in my head think that graphic novels belong best in their own format section, in the same way we put all audio together or all films together, or, you know, that same idea that it's a format thing, and whatever they're about is within that section. So I think that was where we were headed, certainly in our youth department. And I think the other thing is, especially working in a public library, is I want the patrons to lead where we put things in terms of where they look and what they're looking for and what they call them. So that's the easiest way for us, is like, as long as we can understand each other and they know what they're looking for and I know what they're looking for, then I can help them find it. So to design the physical space in that same idea.
That makes complete sense. And I love just put the books where where people want to find them, where they want to be seen. I think that that's key. This is for Meg and Robin. What resources do you recommend to anyone looking for more information on reading graphic novels and using them in a classroom? And Robin, we'll start with you.
So this is a little different in the sense that I obviously worked in a public library. I don't work in a school, but I've thought about this a lot over the years and talked to a lot of very knowledgeable school folks about how they do it. But the main thing that I always suggest is look for obviously school library staff, school centered sort of reviews to help you understand what works for whatever content you're looking for, and that they understand what the kind of things you need to understand are for a school, if you're collecting for a school collection or if you're going to use it in a classroom. Teachers and educators and librarians in schools know best like what that's going to look like and what you'll need to consider in terms of doing it. Some of the places I think of as my kind of automatic go-tos for information about these kinds of things are things like, well, there's School Library Journal's Good Comics for Kids as its own little separate blog of all sorts of things with reviews and interviews and all sorts of guides. The Graphic Library by Sarah Smith is a great school-focused review blog that's really great out there. If you're looking for manga, there's the Manga Librarian, and there's also Manga in Libraries. Both of those websites are run by folks who work with schools. And especially with manga, that can be, I know, a little intimidating because the kids desperately want it. But if you're not familiar with manga, it's a little more, I think, intense and also a little scarier to try to buy what's appropriate for your library and whatever age you're serving, because the kids will want everything and they're not good at filtering what should be in a school.
It's not their job to filter.
No, so I always think that's the best thing to look for. And obviously, I mean, I have my own website, No Flying No Tights, where we try to make sure that we include all of that in everything we review, that if it's especially good for a school, we note that. If, we have people that are looking for that, we know that. And if people send us questions, we will answer them as best we can. But I think in terms of the classroom, that is a little outside my wheelhouse. But in general, I think all of those places are good places to start.
I just want to say,
yeah.
Robin said, Publishers Weekly also obviously has a children's section where we publish broad reviews, actually the reviews are edited by my colleagues, Amanda Ramirez and Amanda Bruns, that hopefully are a resource in the same way that School Library Journal is. Bridget Alverson, who is a Library Journal editor who does a lot of writing on this topic, is another resource to look at. I think a lot of educators have also put out really interesting and useful books. One I edited a while ago now is called When Commas Meet Kryptonite, which was published by Teachers College Press, but there's many of them. And I would just say this is something that's been a trend long enough that colleagues will be a great way to start. So coming to somewhere even like NCTE, looking through what they've done, IRA, you'll see regular panels on this topic and opportunities there to connect with colleagues about ways to use work in the classroom. I think there's a lot of community around these initiatives.
Yeah, a lot of author panels too. Can connect directly with those authors to get the best way of using them in classrooms and libraries. Absolutely. For Whitney and for Robin, how do you personally find new graphic novels to read and recommend? We'll start with Whitney.
I mean, a lot of it's reading, it's seeing what's coming out. I luck out working with a publisher and to see not only everything that Penguin Random House is doing, but then what our competitors are doing. But also I'm also very fortunate to be in a place where not only do I have nieces and nephews and a ton of kids in my life, but also to go to schools and to get to talk to students about creating graphic novels and what to expect in their future goals in a career of wanting to be an author. And a lot of times in those conversations, I ask them, like, what are you reading? What is inspiring you? What is bringing you in that career? And it's always been fun to see how things like subtly shift of like what is bringing people in and what is, making people want to create books. But a lot of that is kind of going out there and engaging with the readers that I want to reach.
Robin?
I think obviously word of mouth is huge, and I certainly would always depend on, especially when I was working as a teen librarian, what the teens were telling me. Like anything they brought up, I'd be like, tell me more. And I would try to find it myself and make sure I understood what was exciting for them about that particular title or creator. The other, honestly, the thing I do all the time is I just follow a ton of creators on social media, on various platforms, and just find out who they're recommending. Who are they looking at? Who are they talking to? Or who are the other creators that are upcoming that they're mentoring or that, you know, are out there kind of, that helps me find new titles really well and new creators, especially because a lot of, you know, the comics world is really lovely that way, and that they talk a lot about who their inspirations are, who their mentors were, but also who are the people they admire right now that are creating. And sometimes that means it's a webcomic that may not come out as a book for a year or two, but at least I've heard of it. And I know that someday that will become a thing. Or is already a thing that may make it to print. So I think that's really useful, especially because comics creators, you know what they're talking about and know what's exciting about what's coming up. So I think that's really helpful for me.
Awesome. My next question is for all of you, and it gets more at the heart of this award and your advocacy of graphic novels. And I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order. So we are going to start with Eva. Somebody wanted to, and I would as well, love to know more about some of the more memorable moments, the never to be forgotten moments in championing graphic novels. And it can just be, you know, a brief memory. But I think as the winners of this award, you guys should take a moment to shine and tell us about a moment you're proud of.
My favorite story is when I was at the reference desk and a girl came up with her mom, and she was looking for a manga series. And I took them over to the section, got them the books. I said, I really loved this series. I think you're going to enjoy it a lot too. And she looked at me, she looked at her mom, she looked at me, she looked at her mom and said, Mom, even old people read these. And that's when I was like, I'm in.
You're cool. Oh, I love that. How about you, Whitney?
I absolutely love that. I I feel like this is more of a recent moment, which is probably why it's top of mind. But I have been teaching at a college SVA this year, talking to again cartoonists who want to be published, and we were going over like books that inspired you, books that made you want to pursue this, like what kind of stories you want to tell, who are the authors, and all the students got to talk a little bit about it. But at the end, a student came up to me because then they're like really shy and they're just like, I wanted to bring up Lumberjanes. And they're like, but then I researched who you were. And so I felt like I couldn't bring up Lumberjanes because I was one of the editors for Lumberjanes.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to make it seem like they were brown nosing, like on the first day of class sort of situation. But they were like, they were talking about like Lumberjanes was the first time they saw themselves in a comic. And
Oh,
it was one of those moments just to like be like, this thing I worked on, you know, forever, at least it feels like forever to me, is like in, you know, helping bring people to this space and letting people see themselves in books. And even though like I'm the editor, it's the authors, it's the storytellers, it's everyone involved who make these things, these books, like it was just very touching to kind of get to have that experience and have that conversation.
oh, I love that for you. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. How about you, Meg?
Wow, there's so much to say about this work. Something that's been very meaningful to me is the work I've done in programming and seeing the way that in-person gatherings and community building brings fresh voices to new readers. And some specific like highlights were working with PEN America and the World Voices Festival and creating a day for young people, which had a strong comics focus. And for example, I believe the first year that I worked on it, which was the inaugural Young People's Day with PEN World Voices, we had Jerry Craft come. And this was, I believe, before Jerry had faced many of the challenges to his work in this period of insidious and horrific book banning and challenges coming against work like Jerry's. Jerry has been a cartoonist in the community for decades, you know, just like really a hardworking, charismatic cartoonist who's put his work out there, self-publishing. And then New Kid was his first book, was a big by press. It was a big deal. So I really wanted to bring him in, and just looking back, like thinking about the opportunity to have Jerry's work as like his before he was a name because of the challenges as a part of Pen America, who has now stood up so much to help oppose these challenges, was just a really meaningful moment. And I just also remember seeing my daughter and other people curled up with his book in the event. You know, he did a drawing as like a live drawing as well as talking with the kids. You just see how much kids connect and read across borders, read across identities through connecting and with these events. And many cartoonists give their time that way. And that's kind of more what I've seen is how willing cartoonists are to share their work and their artistry with the community.
Thank you. And last but not least, Robin.
I'm going to tell a story that I've told a few times before, but it was incredibly important to me as a teen librarian. But about a year ago, maybe a year and a half, I was in my teen room in my old library, and I was doing my usual stuff. And a young man came in and was wandering around the room with a friend and was pointing out, like, I used to go over there, and I used to go over there, and I used to read this series. And I just was like, oh, who could that be? And then I just said, oh, can I help you find anything? Or were you just looking around? And they were like, oh, no, I used to come here, a long time ago when I was a teen. And I kind of said, well, wait, when did you come? And they told me the year. And I was like, oh, that was when I was here. And then at the time, it was still at the time when people were wearing masks, so they couldn't see my face at the moment. And then they turned around and went, wait, are you Robin? And I said, yeah. And then they were just like, oh my God, it's Robin. And they came back over and they gave me a big hug. And it turned out they were a teen that I had known when they were about 11, 12, 13, 14, and were a very tiny and fairly awkward teen at the beginning who had joined our manga and anime club. And then he just gushed for like a half an hour about everything it had meant to him, and that he was now working as an animator in Los Angeles because of everything he learned from that club and all the confidence he'd gained. And he had felt accepted by the group. He's confidently queer in his life and just felt so like all of it had come from that. So it got me.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's wow. And this is why these memories are why you are all on this call today. Just your advocacy is just unparalleled, and we thank you so much. Let's try to lighten the mood a little bit. Trying to think of which question here to ask next. I think this one's interesting. We sort of touched on some of the resources, but I guess for those of you who have any, what G-rated manga recommendations do you have at the moment for those who are trying to get into the genre? We appreciate all the locations that you mentioned, and we're going to include all of the resources that you mentioned in a follow-up email after this. But if you have any off the top of your head, we'd love to hear. Anyone want to go first? Eva?
I will.
I saw you unmuted quickly.
Go ahead, Whitney.
I was sitting here. I feel like Meg mentioned earlier, we're launching our own manga line, Ink Pop, which we're very excited about. But it's also one of those things where that also means doing a deep dive into the manga space, which, as y'all would know, a lot of manga is just categorized automatically like in the adult space, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's only for adults. There's plenty out there that is great for kids. So like I have a huge list. I'm only going to name some, but off the top of my head, Cheese Sweet Home is a personal favorite. That is, it's just a fun cat adventure. Kirby Manga Mania, for people who are familiar with Kirby from like the video games, but also I've always played Kirby and Mario Super Smash Brothers. So whenever that one came out, I was very excited. And then Yuzu the Pet Vet, which is also a very sweet and just charming series. So I just wanted to call those out. And then Ava, did you have your hand up next? Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say Cheese Sweet Home. Cannot keep it on the shelf. Get it in the omnibus. Get as many copies as you can afford. You'll just never have it in. The other one, which seems obvious because it's one of the things that keep the lights on at Viz, is Pokemon. Pokemon anything. Anything with Pokemon. If it starts with a P, just buy it. They're going to want to read it. And the same with Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super. Just get them. They're ubiquitous. You can't swing a cat without hitting Dragon Ball or Pokemon. And there's a reason for that. And it's because the kids devour them. And one of the reasons, I don't know if everybody knows that there's a reason why it's really, really hard to find kids manga. And that's because social mores, differences between Japan and America, what's going to fly in Japan isn't necessarily going to fly in Kansas. And so it's really, really hard to choose books that will sell everywhere. So Whitney, the fact that you guys are coming out with a manga line, I'm thrilled, and I can't wait to find out how you found these titles.
Can I just add a shout out for Totoro as a manga? Totoro is something that means a lot to me. And the book is beautiful. Also, Shuno's Journey, which I don't know if it's G-rated, but it's certainly like on that, for manga, on that side, is a beautiful book that for second published, which is a newer Miyazaki manga. And they published in English for the first time, I believe, last year.
Robin, any recommendations?
The one I'll just add, because I agree with what everyone's already said, that we had an entertaining amount of kids loving. It's a little weird, and it maybe is like a little bit older kid than youngest kid, but is Yokai Cats, which is just about very odd cats who are supernatural in various ways.
I'm
And
noticing
then
a theme.
there are a lot of cat manga. I don't know why that's what gets translated, but it is. And I personally love cats, but it's just one of those ones that we've all found, and we're like passing it around the youth services department, and we're like, this is great. It's very weird, but the kids love it. So
can I
It's
also mention
fun.
Saturday AM line, which is a manga line, an imprint dedicated to diverse characters in manga manhwa style. So very worth checking out as an imprint.
Awesome. Thank you. I've got maybe just two more questions for you. One is for Whitney, but I would love to hear everyone else's responses because I'm personally very interested in wordless graphic novels. And Whitney, I'd love to hear your thoughts on wordless graphic novels and how you sort of think that they fit into the graphic novel world.
I absolutely love wordless graphic novels. I think that, you know, if we could, we would definitely be doing more. I think a lot of it just depends on, you know, how it comes together. But there was one that I edited back in the day called Petals by Gustavo Borges and Chris Peter, which was just a really sweet short story. And then there's one more recently, The Flamingo by Guyo Jing. And again, gorgeously illustrated. And I think that with these wordless graphic novels, the challenge of like, it is truly the epitome of show, not tell, which I think is one of like the strengths of a graphic novel, is because you get to have these emotional beats that you are showing illustrators. Like you don't have to have every panel be like, I'm mad, and then a character doing a grumpy face. Like you get to actually just do these like emotions and these beats in the storytelling where it's just with the body language and the action, which is all part of like, again, critical thinking and visual literacy. And I think that there's just this strength that comes from wordless graphic novels that, I mean, me personally, I would certainly love to see more of.
I have to assume, yeah, Eva, you've unmuted.
Oh, I was going to say the arguments are very similar to those for wordless picture books like The Wave or Tuesday,
Yeah.
where kids and casual readers, the lack of words forces the reader to make connections on their own. They have to strengthen their comprehension on their own. And they're helping to create the story with the author. It's a very collaborative process. There's a lot more going on with wordless books than people give them credit for.
Go ahead, Robin.
I was just going to say that basically the one I always go back to mention to people is The Arrival by Shantan, which is a gorgeous work for absolutely everyone to read. But I think for me, what I love particularly about that story and the way that it's told is that there are things that are, you know, it's a world that's, again, close to ours, but not quite. And there's things that are very obviously not of our world in the images that you see. But the way that they get across the similar experiences of anyone who's an immigrant coming into a new place where they don't know the language, they don't know the customs, they don't know what's happening, but also the way they show where they're coming from. And you have these amazing landscapes that show you what they're trying to flee basically in order to find a better life. And it's just this amazing sort of shift that's always told through the images, but says so much with a single panel or a single image, that makes it really clear what's happening. And I think I've had people ask me, well, kind of, does that count? And I'm like, well, just as much thinking and writing goes into writing a wordless graphic novel. Like, you still have to figure out every single panel. You still have to write out what's happening in each thing. It's a narrative in the same way that anything else is. So it's always important to keep that in mind, is you may not see the words, but a lot of discussion and storytelling went into making that story. So I really love them, and I will always look for the ones that will work for people.
100%. And Sean Tan is arguably the master of the wordless graphic novel. I have just sort of one last question, and it's for everybody. And we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order this time. And that is, what graphic novel or comic or cartoon inspired you as a kid? Because I know that graphic novels and comics are sort of a newer concept and maybe were not available when you were a child. So I'd love to know what you were reading and sort of what really like inspired you to get to this point. Like what were these touch points for you? Eva, we'll start with you.
So as I had mentioned in our kind of pre-talk, I am older than Will Eisner's A Contract with God, so I predate graphic novels. But what I did was grow up reading the comic strips in the newspaper, and I read them because my dad was laughing, and I wanted to know what dad was laughing about. And that is what turned me into a reader, and that is what made visuals and words together so attractive to me, was because dad loved it. And my dad doesn't like anything. And so that's how I got into comics in general.
I love that.
Yeah.
Whitney?
I absolutely love that. I feel like I guess when growing up, I started reading Snoopy. Like, that was the big thing, because that was the comics that were lying around my grandparents' house, was just Peanuts everywhere. And then once it was like me, and then it was Marvel, because my brother was an avid superhero reader. But I felt like the first thing that felt like it was like me making a choice to pursue comics was manga. And so it was picking up manga, Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball, some of the like earlier stuff, Naruto, whenever it was coming out, Hikaru no Go. It was one of those things where reading made it like so exciting. And then of course, and then jumping onto graphic novels, just like Persepolis, and discovering all these titles that were just like, there's this whole world out there of comic books, made me excited and just wanted to know more. Like, how did these books happen? Like, it was really funny, because I was already a avid prose reader, that like, and then my love of story, like once that visual element came in, it was just a different way of reading that just really connected.
Yeah.
And I mean, I still actively read both because I read everything, but it was one of those things where I felt like there's just so much out there that it was, I can't pick one thing that made me fall in love with it, because I
There's
feel
a
like it
whole
was a
new, it opened up a
culmination.
whole new world.
Yeah, it was a whole world of things.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Meg?
So I was also really avid reader as a kid, and maybe obsessive collector of books. In terms of comics, I grew up in a household where my parents had been subscribers to Mad Magazine, and that was a big deal for them. And they had stacks and stacks in our basement. So I was exposed to a lot of cartooning through Mad. Also, Calvin and Hobbes, Berkeley Breathed, Doonesbury, that kind of editorial cartooning and the sort of narrative storytelling through those works really appealed to me. I read a lot of Archie, but a book that I would say I became very attached to as a maybe tweenish reader, younger, was I read the graphic classics Wuthering Heights by Rick Geary, the great indie cartoonist Rick Geary, and that's a very early example, that published in 1990 originally. It's been reissued since, of this trend of adapting classics. And I will say I certainly went on to read Wuthering Heights, read it, reread it. And this figuration of Gary's sort of oddly detailed Heathcliff is like cemented into my formative self. But I think that it helped me understand the story when I later entered it as a text. And that early reading, when Mouse came into our home, which I think my brother, who's younger than me, brought it home from school. And other graphic novels, I really came up during the advent of those being broadly published, alongside being very interested in zine underground publishing, and reading a lot of like unexpected underground works in high school. I have to shout out also the amazing True Stories of a Teenage Single Mom, which is an incredible memoir that ultimately was distributed at Planned Parenthood and became a very meaningful work to me to read about, by Catherine Arnaldi when I was a later teenager, just thinking about women's stories in feminist history through memoir and comics.
Thank you. And Robin.
So like a lot of what everyone said, I was in this weird gap as a generation where we didn't have comics. They weren't in comic. I didn't have anyone in my life that would have taken me to a comic book store, for example. So we didn't have any comics in my house. We read comics compilations. So like I was a big Garfield kid because I liked anything with cats. And I also read a lot of what other people said, Calvin and Hobbes, a lot of the strips of the newspapers. I would see comics there, but none of that really cemented for a long time. I didn't really understand that there were longer stories that I could read in that format because they were not visible to me. I actually grew up wanting to be an animator more than anything else because I loved animation. And slowly over the years, I figured it out. But I will say, even though this didn't happen until later when I was starting out my library career, but I was still like in my early 20s, for me, the manga boom was the big thing that made me understand what comics meant. And the fact that when manga really started in like the year 2000, so to speak, in that one of the booms. But the fact that they had a whole audience that was aimed at women and girls was distinct from what I had read before that. A lot of the classics and things I'd been told to read were I was not the target audience. Whereas when I started finding manga was when I was like, oh no, these are actually intended for me. Like I'm supposed to like these. These are supposed to be for me. And that was a huge shift because before that, and that's obviously changed an enormous amount since then. Like now there's comics for way more than, and all sorts of different audiences. But at the time, it was a big impact to have something really expressly be for me as a direct line.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that I have for you all. I'd love to open it up to everyone on the call and just say over the next, minute or so, if anybody has any questions for this group, please feel free to put it into the chat and we'll get it answered. While you're putting your questions in the chat, just a fun reminder that this is being recorded and all of the resources that have been mentioned, all the websites and everything that's been mentioned, all the books, those will all be featured in a follow-up email to be sent at a later date. So no worries if you didn't catch it on this go around. I guess it's only Tuesday. I was going to ask if anyone has any fun plans for the weekend.
About reading as a kid, one thing that's a really like tactile memory for me was I used to just like crush in my Babysitter's Club novels so I could like feel them on the top, like feel the tension of how many.
Yes.
So when Raina's first Babysitter's Club adaptation came out, and I was young in publishing, I like cried. I mean, reading it and the memory of how powerful those stories were for me. So seeing some of again, like the conversation between prose and comics has been really meaningful, I think, for our generation of advocates.
It's a nice note. I was going to say you can do that with the Lumberjanes too. Just run your hand across the tops of all of them. That was a pretty formative series for me. I'm not going to lie. I loved that series. It's one of the first real series I ever, I think, dove into.
It was the first original long series because before most of it had just been like licensing, so Adventure Time, Steven Universe, all that stuff.
It took me a minute to collect all of them. Speaking of collecting books, I'm a collector, so. I want to.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Meg.
Well, the webtoon trend that we're talking about is really interesting in the ways that it taps into that collector instinct, because I think historically, this gets into a deeper dive, but a lot of cartoonists were encouraged to take their work offline in the early webcomics days if they wanted to publish it as a book. But we're really seeing in the current trends of webtoons becoming books that people want to obsessively read them online and then collect them as a book, as an object. So I think that's really interesting. And they might, in a library, come to it in the first time, return it, read it online, come back to it. That gets back to this concept of reading and rereading, but also I feel like sometimes comic books or graphic novels will be the book that stays if there's the quote unquote death of print, which isn't happening, because they're art objects, they're collector's objects in a different and distinctive way.
I agree. I think that we've got some questions here, and I think the second one is particularly interesting. How do you overcome a public library that doesn't support controversial award-winning graphic novels being housed in the teen room? I know we only have a couple of minutes, but I think we're okay to go over if anybody wants to be the first to tackle that question.
I mean, I will bring up one immediate resource that I can offer at least. There's a lot of different tactics people could take. But one I wanted to point out that the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable has an advocacy toolkit that's all about challenges in libraries and gives you everything, a kind of guide to everything you need to do in terms of what happens before, what happens during, what happens after, and all the different ways you can have that discussion/fight in the library world. So I really recommend looking at a ton of work went into it. We have a ton of also webinars actually about how to deal with that, and they're all recorded at the GNCRT website. So I think that's one thing to really keep in mind, that there's a lot of people that have unfortunately had to deal with this and are sharing their knowledge and their kind of hard-won expertise about how to figure that out. It is hard. I certainly understand how difficult it can be, especially when it feels personal. If you are the teen person, it feels very targeted. But the main thing is to really think through, the what you have already established at your library in terms of a collection development policy, in terms of how you discuss teen versus kids versus adults, what's the language you have in your policies, how can you defend that, make sure that you have things, included, even if you have a challenge that you then go on to edit things into the future. You can say, okay, let's make sure that our challenge policy says that you have to be a resident of the town or the city that you're in, or that you have to have read the entire graphic novel. You can't just pull out a page. All the ways that you can really make it so that it's where there are more requirements to challenge a graphic novel in your community, that keeps it from being a kind of nuisance challenge. But it's a tough world. I mean, it's extremely hard right now. And I really feel for everybody that has to fight for that, especially when it's your job and it's your community and it feels so incredibly hard.
Personal.
Yeah, but I think the toolkit is really there, and I would recommend, if anyone wants more advice, reach out to the GNCRT, especially, and everyone there will work hard to connect you with local people, as well as helping you figure out the tactics that you need to do the fight.
Thank you, Robin. And you'll see that Carl posted a link to the GNCRT here in our chat. We have just a couple of minutes. Does anybody want to add to what Robin said? Okay. I think on that note, again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything you guys do on a daily basis. We are eternally grateful and so glad that we could grab you for an hour today to pick your brains about graphic novels and comics. A reminder again that this has been recorded and will be shared later in the week. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, this was fun.